Here's another one you don't want to hear. Frankly, the July.
1, 2, 3, set, go.
Hello and welcome to episode 34 of the Power Chord Hour podcast. Hope you're doing well out there, and thank you so much for checking out yet another episode. As always, I'm your host, Anthony Merchant, here with you, and this is our first episode of September. Thank you very much. I'm doing this in the WRFA studios right now in downtown Jamestown, and it's hard to believe that it was just a few weeks ago, I feel like, that if I was in the studio right now, it would still, I could still see daylight. But we have some really nice big windows here in the studio looking down onto downtown Jamestown. And it already looks like night. I mean, I guess it is nighttime now. I hate that. I love the fall, but the one thing that I don't like about it is how it starts just getting dark so early. I feel like it just kind of came out of nowhere. But, it feels like and it looks like fall right now. But it is our first episode of September, and I am coming to you this week solo. We will probably have a guest next week, but all good. We are here to talk music as always, but this time it is just me. And, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about this week. And, probably some of our most popular episodes of the podcast, and honestly, some of my favorite interviews to do are, kind of album anniversary interviews, kind of talking to bands who maybe aren't even releasing anything new at the moment, but, released a landmark album, X amount of years ago. And this is a landmark anniversary for them. And, sadly this year, with coronavirus, people aren't going out and playing shows. It hasn't always been that way, even though it probably feels like it's been forever. But the last decade, obviously the big thing for anniversaries of albums is going out and playing, the album front to back. It really wasn't a thing, I would say, until Jimmy Eat World. I feel like they always get brought up in this show. But, they're really the first band. Maybe there could have been others before that. I know people have played their albums front to back live before, but that idea of doing an album anniversary show, Jimmy Eat World had to have really kind of opened the floodgates to that back in 2009 with the Clarity 10-year tour. But, this last decade, if you had a record come out in the early 2000s or even the 90s or whatever, it's you would hit that 10-year mark or that 15-year mark, and they just start, album anniversary tour. You're basically, it's funny because once again, Corona's kind of slowed it down. And but for a while there, I would say that if your favorite record was celebrating, like I said, its 10th anniversary or its 15th anniversary, you could basically bet on it that you were going to get a tour and that record was going to get repressed on vinyl. That was a given, just an absolute given. That's just what it was there for a while in the punk and alternative scene. And I always like that though. Some people aren't into that, and I like the whole celebration of it. People, even artists sometimes have, and I get it too, that they don't want to be too nostalgic or indulge too much in a certain thing. And I also think, for artists sometimes too, there's records, including, early on, say your debut record where you've grown so much since then, but that may still be your biggest record, or it may be what your fan, the fan favorite. And it's it may be an inner struggle, not even an inner struggle. I don't want to make it sound too dramatic, but kind of this conflict where you as an artist have moved on from that sound or that record, and your audience still very much wants that out of you, and you may not want to, you know what I mean? You don't want to indulge in that so much because it's been a conflict most of your career to get out of the, the overshadowing of that one, that one record that really made you explode. So, there's artists and stuff who I know don't get into the anniversary thing. And there's some fans who don't, who, look at it as a cash grab and whatnot. But I'm always into the anniversary thing, whether it be anniversary shows or the reissues and stuff. And I love doing the interviews here, talking about the records. But, not only do I love doing that, but if you listen to the show, you probably know that, probably my favorite decade of music would be the 90s. A lot of the stuff that I cover on here, a lot of those album anniversaries I was talking about, A lot of that comes from the 90s. Even I mean, bands who I interview on here for new stuff, a lot of them were established then. Like, that was just an era that, you know, speaks to me for whatever reason. You know, I mean, I love music of all eras and whatnot, but I would say most of my favorite bands started in the 90s. And, you know, I also think it may not hurt that my favorite band is The Replacements. And, you know, I mean, basically the alternative genre in the 1990s was all bands just trying to, you know, out Westerberg one another. You know, Paul and company kind of made that, you know, the map or whatever, wrote the map in the 80s. And, you know, after breaking up in 91, I feel like that, you know, most bands took that road map. And, you know, and I think that may, you know, which I guess it depends if you like 90s music or not. You could either thank or blame Paul Westerberg for that. But, you know, I don't think that's a terrible thing to say that he may play a role in why I love 90s music so much. But, you know, one of the years I was thinking about was 1995. I mean, that's 25 years ago, which is, you know, I mean, just absolutely crazy to think about. But on top of that, I mean, I was thinking about that, and I think part of it, too, I noticed a lot of records, like my favorite records from a lot of my favorite bands, came out in that year. And, you know, just a really great year for music, enough where, you know, I want to dedicate the podcast to it. And it was funny because I was thinking about it, and I'm like, why that year? Like, I wonder why it's so good, or why it seems like it was so good, and why there were so many good records that came out. And, you know, I just finally got to it. I've been meaning to, I didn't read it, but I listened to the audiobook, and I cannot recommend it enough, actually. But ever since it came out back in 2016, NoFX's The Hepatitis Bathtub and Other Stories, I've meaning to read it. And just recently I read the audiobook, or listened to the audiobook. Amazing. All the parts were read by NoFX. With the former, you know, all four, like the, you know, solid, like what we all know, the NoFX lineup, but like some of the dudes from like the earlier incarnations of NoFX and like the earlier lineups do not do their parts. Instead, they're narrated by Tommy Chung and Jello Biafra. So yeah, if you want to hear the NoFX audiobook narrated by NoFX and Jello Biafra and Tommy Chung, which who wouldn't want to hear that? I highly recommend it. I will say the book is a lot darker than I thought it would be. I mean, it has a lot of funny parts, but tons and tons of dark parts. Kind of like Trouble Boys in that way. The Replacements, which is my favorite music bio of all time. Bob Mayer absolutely killed it. But that's another one where you read it, and I mean, yes, the antics of the Replacements are in there. There's hilarious parts, but I mean, there's also just, you know, like the stuff with Bob and, you know, just a lot of other stuff in there, just extremely sad, you know, and it has some dark parts. And it's the same thing with the Hepatitis Bathtub. But, you know, listening to it, they got to that era of, you know, basically the mid-90s. And it wasn't even specifically 95, but I mean, just kind of talking about the punk explosion and Nirvana and what that really did for NoFX and Fat Records, and I mean, just punk bands in general. And I mean, you know, everyone kind of knows 1994 is the year that punk broke. And I mean, they were talking about that in, Fat Mike specifically was talking about it, and just, you know, what that would do for the band and for the record label, as well as Epitaph and the rest of them. And, you know, in 1991, you had Nevermind and, you know, the grunge explosion. Then a couple years later, you know, in 94, you had, you know, Dookie and Smash, and all these huge punk rock records come out and just sell ungodly amounts of copies. And for the first time, you know, punk being a commercial success, you know, like charting, you know, on Billboard and whatnot, and really an amazing thing. So when you start to think about that and reading the book and thinking about, you know, how that would inspire people, because, you know, like the other thing too, what they said, and I think it was Smelly who said it in there, was like, you know, Dookie was a good example of that, where he's like, you know, after a while when it started selling really well, it was easy to write Green Day off, and, you know, they weren't the cool band and they were the sellout band and stuff. But he's like, you know, make no mistake, before that happened, like, we were all listening to that and thinking of how amazing it was and how good it was. And, you know, I mean, I think that's the thing. Like, part of it is like what came out during that time, you know, not only exploded in 94, but a lot of it was just such high quality. You know, I mean, Dookie, in my opinion, is Green Day's best record, and a lot of people agree with that. What I will say for Green Day, though, and this is an amazing thing because most bands have like that one record that everyone basically, for the most part, agrees is their best record. You know, like you may find diehards and stuff who will pick like an obscure record as their favorite, but you know, most people, like for the Descendants, most people would probably say Milo Goes to College. Like, you know, there's a lot of bands where, you know, it's that record, but like with Green Day, they're so lucky because I would say they had, you know, Dookie, and then they have American Idiot later on. And, you know, I mean, other people have, you know, people have favorites in between, but it's like to have two records the size of, you know, and to have the cultural impact and to sell the amounts of copies that both Dookie and American Idiot did is something that you rarely do twice in your career, let alone once, which is amazing. But, you know, Green Day putting out such a great record in 94, same with The Offspring, as well as, you know, that also the money that gave Epitaph and, you know, putting money behind that and being able to put money behind your bands. And really, too, you know, because of that punk explosion, if you look at what was coming out in 94 as well as 95, and, you know, more specifically 95 we're going to get into here, but if you look at it, these are not like super polished records. These are not like super poppy. Like they really... It's funny because, like, you know, like in 95, punk bands and alternative bands were still going, you know, signing to major labels. And once again, as we're speaking about, this is a time when it did sell, you know, that labels did want, you know, the next whatever that was. You know, they wanted the next Rancid. They wanted the next Green Day, you know, and before that, they wanted the next Nirvana. And it kind of, you know, I think from that, because that's the other thing. I don't think punk would have hit in 94 the way it did had grunge not hit a few years prior. Like, had Nevermind not been released and gotten as big as it was, you know, I mean, for one, the grunge movement and the whole grunge scene would have never blown up probably. And at least to the volume it did. I mean, a lot of great bands, other bands came out of that and a lot of great records, but I don't know that it ever would have gotten to the size it did. And, you know, with that, you know, it kind of really did trailblaze for punk later on, you know, just a few years later. But you weren't really like, you know, major labels were putting money into these raw, you know, like real bands and like honestly didn't really take, you know, that raw energy out of a lot of them, you know, like they were putting things out where these bands were just putting out better music than their records before, but they weren't particularly like changing their sound up or anything like that. Like a really good one, and you know, one that we've talked extensively on here because we had the drummer Greg Eklund on earlier in the year. But Everclear Sparkle and Fade. I mean, that's a favorite of mine. Just no matter what we're talking about, just a favorite record of mine. But like if you listen to that, you go, that was on Capitol Records, and it's not a polished album at all. It sounds like a continuation of their first record, World of Noise. Like, it's a little cleaner than that, but I mean, not by much. And like, really, it just sounds like a stronger set of songs. Like, it doesn't sound like a different band. It just sounds like a band that went and wrote an even better record, you know, that happened to have some, you know, huge hits on it. But, you know, talking to Greg Eklund and, you know, doing that interview, like he said, they were just kind of a trio, you know, just three guys who just wanted to be in a really good rock band. Like, they were raw, you know, they were just writing these songs. There weren't ghostwriters, there weren't co-writers, you know, they were producing the stuff themselves. It was basically three guys in a studio just doing it. And, you know, I also asked, like, you know, with like what kind of things, you know, the major labels did, because it is a thing back then, you know, or still even, you know, where kind of the stereotype is like, you know, you get grabbed by the major labels and they're going to polish your sound and they're going to take all the stuff that made you good out. And listen, that does happen. Like, you know, it'd be crazy to deny that doesn't happen. But, you know, I think one of the things that major labels really got right was, I think there was a time there in 1995 where they weren't doing that. You know, they weren't doing that yet with these bands. They were letting them sound like that, because same with Nevermind. Nevermind, you know, sonically doesn't sound bad. Like, it doesn't sound rough in the sense that it, you know, like it sounds like a shitty, you know, like demo cassette that someone recorded in their garage. Like, it's obviously, you know, because if you listen to something like that, it's gonna sound like it was recorded in there. Whereas Nevermind doesn't sound like that. It sounds like it was recorded in a good studio, but it's still very loud, raw guitars and raw drums and bass. And, there's not a lot of overdubs in there. There's not a bunch of crazy things. And, once again, the success of that, I think also, allowed that where maybe those labels would go, well, let's let a band like Everclear, like, hey, we did sign them because they sounded like this. Like, maybe we shouldn't mess around with that sound too much. And that's what Greg said, is they didn't really do it. He had a funny story about them adding a chorus to Santa Monica, but it's like there really wasn't a lot of like, oh, we should change the key to this, or like, maybe if you raise the tempo on this or lower it on this, we need it closer to like 120 BPM. That's like what a lot of like pop music is in, and like that tempo and stuff. Like they didn't do calculated stuff like that for a lot of these records, and it's why that year, really did produce such good stuff. Had they went in on a Sparkle and Fade and kind of treated it like, some of those later Everclear records where, they are kind of more polished and there are more layers, and it is more of a, kind of like studio project where it's like, those songs may have started on an acoustic guitar, maybe just three guys jamming, but it's like there was a lot of things added when going into studio. And, during that time, you just didn't hear it. It was kind of more innocent with records like that, that could be out on a major label. There's, another one like that, like Insomniac, like we were speaking about Green Day. And it's crazy to think about because 1994 was the year that Dookie came out. And just exploded for Green Day. And, you think of how long those singles like were out there. And, I'm sure they were still releasing them in 1995. They were still putting out singles for Dookie. And it's insane to think that Green Day put out Insomniac like just a year later. Once again, Dookie is such a career-defining record, and you already put the follow-up out, a year later. Which the other funny thing about that, if I'm not making the whole episode about Green Day, but if you look at American Idiot, the follow-up for that, for 21st Century Breakdown, that was like, there was some time in between there. I think it was like 4 or 5 years in between records for that one. So it's so funny how, Green Day, the first time they had a huge, massive record, they followed it up right away. And then the second time it happened, they took like half a decade, for the follow-up. And, Insomniac, I don't think it's better than Dookie, but the thing is I don't think they were going to put out a record. Listen, like when you put out an album like that, and once again, amazing that they did it a second time with American Idiot, but it's crazy. It would be next to impossible and crazy to hit the strides that they did with Dookie on Insomniac. And also with the sound, they all admit it, and it was like they wanted to be raw and punk still on that record, because Dookie was getting so big, or not even getting, it was big, they were massive at that point. They kind of wanted, as a response, to do something a little darker than Dookie and more punk and a little heavier at times. And as far as someone who's just a fan of punk music or whatever, I love it. I think Insomniac is great. From a commercial standpoint, though, I could see why it wouldn't be as big as Dookie. But once again, I don't think anything could be, because even if they went in and tried to rewrite like When I Come Around or Basket Case, I don't think they could. Part of the magic about Dookie is that those songs aren't, polished and have like 6 people who co-wrote it. It's not. They're just simple 3-chord songs that are very catchy, And there's 3-chord songs that are very catchy on Insomniac. But, they also go different places and do different things and a little more rough around the edges. But once again, when you listen to that, how rad is that Green Day was such a massive band, and you listen to Insomniac, and it's like that's a major label band with, millions of dollars behind them. They I'm sure had a huge budget for recording it, and, something you don't see every day, something that would not have happened even when Green Day started in 88, if you look back at the year 1988, punk bands weren't getting on major labels. That wasn't a thing. That's crazy to think about. But here they were, and once again, without really an uncompromised sound, I would say. I'm sure the labels gave them shit and wanted, and don't get me wrong, there were singles on there, but when you look, it pales in comparison to the sales and, the amount of airplay that the songs on Insomniac got compared to Dookie. Still one of the best Green Day records in my opinion. But, for a major label to release something like that, it really kind of was a sliver in time, because wouldn't it have done it, 10 years prior? And I don't think they would have did it 10 years later, because by the time Green Day got to American Idiot, we're obviously a much more polished sound and, a lot more mainstream. I would say something like, Boulevard of Broken Dreams or Holiday or American Idiot, the title track, most of the stuff on there is a lot more radio friendly and mainstream friendly than what you'll find like on Insomniac. And it's kind of interesting, but it is this kind of sliver in time. Another reason why 1995 was just such a great year, I think, for music, because yes, a lot of the great bands were on major labels at this time. This was a time where you wanted to be on a major label, but I don't feel like labels were messing around with the sound. Were they fucking the bands in other ways? I'm sure there were money, they were still screwing bands over with money and, royalties and things like that. But as far as the music went, I don't feel like they were doing that too much, because you also look at that later on and if you look at Blink-182 might be around that era, I would say 1999 and with Enema of the State, where you at that point, and it's not that major labels, I think, were controlling Blink-182 or anything like that. I love Enema of the State. I think a lot of it was their own conscious effort and also working with Jerry Finn to make a more mainstream friendly sound and record. But with that said, as that was getting popular, that's a different sound than, say, the rawness of Insomniac. And, it kind of shifts from there, where I think major labels were starting to polish bands more and did want them to sound cleaner and more radio friendly. I think there was a time though in the 90s where that kind of stuff worked. I mean, another one, a huge thing like in music and including the stuff I play on the radio show and just everything this show's about. 120 minutes is such an important program. And I mean, shout out to Matt Pinfield, a hero of mine. But that he started his debut on 120 Minutes was in 1995. So that was 25 years ago. He started being the host of 120 Minutes. And I mean, you look back at those performances, the music videos they played. Even guest hosts they'd have on, his interviews, everyone who he'd have on. So amazing. And to have, at that time, MTV being what it was, truly being able to give exposure to bands and truly mean something. That was a time where if you were on MTV, that would do something for your career. And, look at you, there wasn't room for, say, Archers of Loaf or Hum on, a lot of the other mainstream programs on MTV. But with 120 Minutes, that was the outlet on still such a large platform and, got that music out to people who otherwise wouldn't hear it. Everyone, MTV's so big and you get MTV anywhere in the country. And that was still at a time where if you, now the great equalizer is the internet. If you live in the middle of Iowa, you have access, on the internet to all the same music as someone who lives in, say, Portland. It's the same access. If you have the internet, it's all there for you. Whereas at that time, you had to have a record store that you could go to. And then, if that record store didn't carry the thing you were looking for, you'd have to get special ordered. It was a time where you had to hunt things down more and, things like that. So MTV was a thing where, if you lived in, say, rural Iowa, you may not have the cool record store where you can go in and ask, the guy working behind the counter, hey, what are the cool bands right now? Who are the cool alternative bands? You don't have that, or not a record store you walk in and we're playing Superchunk or something. And that's how you heard them, you didn't have that everywhere. So 120 Minutes, though, because once again, you have MTV in those places where you want to have the cool record store. So 120 Minutes is a place where people could hear these bands, and did expose them to that. So, Matt Pinfield, even to this day, just, a guy who exposes people music that they otherwise probably wouldn't hear, and does it at a mainstream level too, which I always think is cool. But and one of the things I love too about him is he's probably interviewed him other times, but his first time interviewing Paul Westerberg in what had to be 95 or 96, it had to be his first or second year doing 120 minutes. But his interview with Paul Westerberg, it's nothing groundbreaking. I mean, he doesn't ask any it's not like this like earth-shattering interview where like there's all these revelations or like he gets Paul Westerberg to open up a lot. But what I like about it is that you can tell there's a nervousness there and there's a respect. Like you can tell that he's legitimately a fan and that, he gives a shit and that he's intimidated. He knows who this is. He knows it's Paul Westerberg. He knows the reputation. He knows the lyrical genius that he's dealing with. Like, it's something that I look at that and I go, that guy gives a shit. He gave a shit. There's a reason he was the host of 120 minutes. And, just a huge impact once again on not just the year 1995, I mean, the 90s in general. And, once again, to this day, still doing it, which I think is amazing and, really cool. Big ups to him. But, 120 minutes being something where, I feel like major labels could let those kind of odder bands out there who, have a sound that you wouldn't think is radio friendly, and maybe it's not for, say, top 40, but you had something like 120 minutes where they could get on there and that could move units. It may not be, on the top 40 countdown. It may not be on TRL, which I know TRL is a couple years later, but if it's not on there, it could be on 120 minutes. And, that really gave it something. And really, like, one band who ended up getting, like, radio airplay, getting their music videos on MTV, and another great example of that where it's just, like, looking at what, really was given a chance back in the 90s. And this one not even from a major label. I mean, on Epitaph, which, their second success, they had The Offspring selling, like 11 million copies of Smash. And then in 1995, Rancid comes out and kind of continues that punk explosion of 1994. Really, because there are a lot of punk bands who put out some great records in 95. But if we're talking like big numbers, and Out Come the Wolves, I mean, still a punk rock classic to this day. I mean, does not sound like it's 25 years old. It's ageless. But, that record sold ungodly amounts too, and it's like, that's a straight up punk rock record. That's not even like that's not even pop punk. You know what I mean? Like, even Green Day on Insomniac is like more pop punk, whereas Rancid, like, no, like that, for one, all those guys look like they're gonna fucking rob you and kick your ass. Like, they all look like that. Like, Tim and Lars both look like, they're like the front men, but it's like, yeah, they look like they would kick your ass in an alleyway and steal your wallet, and it's like that record is raw. It's, there's bass solos all over it. It's, if you really look at an Out Come the Wolves, it's also, and it's like 19 or 20 tracks. It's, it's rough around the edges. There's a lot of cursing on it. And just all these different things where, like, you would not think that it was going to be that huge, big, successful album. But then again, none of these were. I think that's the other charm of it, is I don't know that anyone ever thought that, The Offspring Smash was going to be that, or that Nevermind was going to be the record that it was. That's part of the charm. I think you went in, and that's the other thing that, major labels and just bands in general, not even always major labels, they're just labels who make bands get that more polished sound. But, I think with that, it really kind of fucks things over, where I think you're just better off, kind of keeping that, like, rawness and what makes a band, really good. To fuck with that is just, I don't think it's normally in the best interest, of anybody. And I think if you listen to a record like an Out Come the Wolves, once again, it's like, there's not really, you wouldn't think there's a formula there for it to be something huge. Like, it really has no business getting, the attention that it did per se, outside of, like, really the people who, loved Fat Records and Epitaph, and there were a lot of people who did. But once again, even with that said, as big as Fat and Epitaph were in the 90s, it's not like every record they put out were going gold and platinum. Like, Fat Records has 1 or 2 gold records. I don't think they have any platinum records. And, Epitaph, sure. They had they have a handful of records, which still, I mean, to this day, I think Smash is still considered like the highest selling independent record of all time. I mean, they had some massive ones, but it's not like everything they're releasing was selling millions and millions of records. That just wasn't the case. But for whatever reason, on that one, it seemed to break. But I think with that though too, the bands, like we're talking about some of these ones that like sold amazing, amounts of copies. But there's also other ones where, once again, like Fat Records was putting out ones where maybe they weren't selling millions of records, but I mean, Lagwagon put out Hoss, No Use for a Name put out Leche Con Carne. Even though it didn't come out that year, Fat Records re-released Face to Faces Don't Turn Away in 1995. Like a lot of really important records, which once again, they're not like, they're not selling like and Out Come the Wolves did, by any means necessary. But those records are huge, like, I mean, if you're a fan of those labels, you're a fan of the genre, it's like those are huge fucking records, and all of that kind of came out in 1995. Like that was even records that weren't maybe even like commercially, once again, huge sellers, or even to that point, maybe not even the band's biggest records. But, a lot of bands put out like their landmark records, like I was talking about, like with Dookie, and, like those records that kind of define you, that become basically what you're playing, those anniversary shows. It's like, that's the record that we're going to, in 20 years, we're going to, do the anniversary tour, and we're going to, put out some vinyl, that like that kind of thing. And, Fat Records just did that, and Epitaph as well. Just a lot of them where, hey, we're not going to sell 1 million copies of these, but it's like they'll be remembered, And that was another part of the kind of going back to the hepatitis bathtub that they talked about a couple times, where it's like, there's certain things you could do in music where, maybe you can get a step up or a step ahead, doing this or that, but it's like, it ends up, you end up getting screwed in the end, because what you really want is longevity. It's not the gimmicks of what will make you popular in the, in that second. It's more of the longevity and what will make it good, and that's kind of sincerity. And, Fat Mike also talking about, starting Fat Records and really only wanting to release what he likes, not releasing something because it's going to sell millions of copies, releasing it because it's good. And, for one, that gives you a better track record. And, not to talk shit on Epitaph Records, but, they're business-wise, they are smarter and probably do have more gold and platinum records than Fat Records does. But if you look throughout time, I think Epitaph probably started more like that, where, Brett would sign bands that he liked. And, after a while, it does become a business. And, not to say that he like dislikes everything that he signs, but it did become more eclectic, where I would say at some point the signings on Epitaph are no longer just because Brett likes that band, but more of, well, is it going to sell? Is this something that we can move units on? And I don't know if there's anything wrong with that. I mean, that's honestly the purpose of a major label. But I will say that's probably the reason why I think if you look at Epitaph in, like, say, 1995, another great one like Pennywise, About Time, Epitaph having bands like that. And even in 95, actually, I think No Effect's still being, funny enough, on Epitaph. I think at that point they still would have been on there. But actually, no, they would have just left, because while they didn't release a full length in 95, they did release, which, I mean, has become kind of a classic live record, but I Heard They Suck Live. That one did come out in 95, and that was on Fat Records, but that might have been like one of their, like, I don't know, one of the first releases they put out on at least No Effects on Fat. Obviously, there are other bands before that, but yeah, still kind of early on there. But anyways, that's another reason why I think there's so many classics that you look from that year and you're like, oh my God, like that came out and that came out and that came out. Because it's like, it's not that Fat was choosing bands because, hey, this is going to sell a bunch. They were choosing bands that they knew were good and were going to put something good out. And, once again, what you get out of that ends up being like some of the best records of those bands' career. I mean, Hoss is, that's my second favorite Lagwagon record, but that's a lot of people's favorite. Let's Talk About Feelings is easily my favorite Lagwagon record, but Haas would be easily second. I mean, Leche Con Carne, my favorite No Use for a Name record, and that one probably gave them commercially too, because that one has Soulmate on it. That was probably their biggest record, and both came out in 1995, and once again, that's kind of where that explosion kind of came from too. The 90s skate punk is kind of, I would say, starts around 95, because bands are releasing records like that and then spent the rest of the 90s, like the second half of the 90s, releasing more classics, like the Strung Outs, like the Lagwagons, like the Face to Faces, like the Pennywises. Like, I feel like they all really shined on the second half of the 90s. If you really look at that and you look at it as a whole, it's not that, like, punk rock was shining from 1990 to 1999 the entire time. I would say like 93 to 94 to like 99 was like really the sweet spot there, altogether. I mean, that was really the time. And I think once again, records like An Out Come the Wolves, really, I think also probably gave inspiration, because it's not even that every punk band had to listen to that and go, oh, well, we're going to write a record to sell, all these sell all these copies of our album. But instead what it could be is even though you may not be aiming to be this huge band, you can at least look and go, oh, well, this is doable. Like, you still see these bands get huge and go, well, there's at least somewhere in the middle for us, or something like that, because there are genres, once again, like punk, where, maybe 10, 15 years prior to that, which, if you go back to 1980, say, it may be harder, to sustain your band, and people may not be coming out as much, and it's harder to really get started, where once that explosion hits, once again, you may not be the next Rancid, but people are paying attention to this genre, and you may be able to get, 200 or 300 kids to come out and, buy tickets to your shows and buy t-shirts and a 7-inch. And, once again, you're not a millionaire, but you're making a living, doing your music, which, is a great thing. So, I mean, 1995, I think, was a pretty important year, for Epitaph and Fat, because once again, I mean, you had the explosion in 94, but I think where you would really feel it is the following year, once things really start getting released in the wake of that. 94 was the time for it to really start going, and, the kind of the domino effect, if you will, is kind of what you saw in 1995 with that, and major labels also, basically picking up anything that Epitaph or Fat didn't. And, I mean, the flip side too, like I was saying, I mean, there were a lot of things that I think, for as much shit as major labels get, there were a lot who kind of let bands have that freedom and, did sign them and realize it's like, hey, we signed them for a reason. We should let them, kind of continue doing what they're doing. Don't fix it if it's not broken. But, I mean, some bands around the major labels, though, I mean, for every band who, once again, like on the smaller ones who are selling, Rancid may sell 3 million, but just because you're on Epitaph, not everyone's selling 3 million. And same with the major labels, not every punk band who, got signed to a major, actually, really at the end of the day, probably more of a majority never really made it. You're kind of throwing them to the wall and see what sticks. And, it's not to say that not a lot of great records didn't come out, but I mean, commercially, like one, to kind of go on some of my favorite records of all time, Jawbreaker put out Dear You in 1995, and one of my favorite albums of all time from any band. But that's a good example of that. I mean, signing to a major label, and for one, at a time where, you get sellout thrown at you, and people just being pissed off, and then not even giving the record the time of day. And, it's funny to look back now, because at the time, the record, not that Dear You sounds very polished, but it was an expensive record to make. And at the time, there were things on it where you're like, oh, like there is some production, but, like now it would probably cost like nothing to make. Then it was like, I mean, thousands and like hundreds of thousands of dollars, I believe, to make. Like, not a cheap record at all. It was on Geffen. And, like the budget behind it and everything. And like there's a few instances where I still can hear it, like on Accident Prone, like those choruses, like that wall of sound with those guitars, like things like that. I'm like, like that's where you really hear, we're like, oh yeah, that's probably where it went, in the budget. But it's just funny to think about now. But like there was a time where people were pissed at that, like, oh, that sound is polished, which, I mean, really, go listen to that record. Polished is not a word I would use for Dear You. and it's like, oh, it sounds like this and it's not that. And it's like, but if you go listen back now and all those things are silly, and we all know that now, that's all, a band signing to a major label and being mad at them and not listening to them or turning your back on them, like when they play new songs, when you go to see them, is foolish. And, you can look back and see that. But at the time, it was detrimental to them. That's kind of the flip side of that, where you could sign to a major and maybe sell, an ungodly amount of your record. And that's awesome. And, some people may be pissed at you for doing it, but you're probably going to get, triple, maybe 5 times the amount of fans that you're, for like, the handful that you're going to lose, you're going to gain thousands and thousands. But the flip side of that is like with Jawbreaker, where you put out Dear You, and the old fans are pissed at you and, are not happy with you, and you're not really gaining those new fans that you thought you would. No one new's really coming out, and they don't understand what you're doing. And, whether it be that or, major labels, once again, they may put more money behind, one band and they do another. And, maybe you're not getting the right support or the right promotion for whatever reason it is. I mean, there's always more than one reason. I don't think there's ever just one, I don't think there's one reason why something is very popular. And I don't think there's one reason why something isn't very popular. It's kind of a combination of things. But whatever the combination was for Dear You, I mean, was not good for them. Obviously, they ended up breaking up after that, and I mean they had tension beforehand, but still, I mean, if there was, I'm sure they would even tell you that if things had went differently and maybe the major label thing was more positive, maybe they had sold more records, maybe all of that, maybe people may have still been pissed at them for signing to a major, but had those new fans come, maybe things would have been different. I mean, maybe they wouldn't have walked away from that had they, like, you look at them now and they're playing like festivals and theaters and stuff. And, you can't help but think that maybe if that success came, 25 years earlier, they may have just kept going. I mean, maybe they wouldn't have taken that, whatever 16, 17 year hiatus that they have. And actually, I think more than that. I think that was like closer to like, I think a 20-year hiatus that they took, and I don't know. It's interesting to think about. I mean, they have talked about writing a new record since reuniting, and I mean, Jawbreaker is one of my favorite bands. I would obviously go listen to it, but I don't know. I'm not someone, as much as I love them, I'm someone who also thinks, look, you haven't put out a record in 25 years. If you really feel strongly about it, you really think it's something that you are, that you're going to put the name on and it's worth putting, in the band's legacy, totally, like, go for it. But I am cautious with things like that, where like, I don't think that every band has to reunite and put out a record. Like, I'm cool with some bands just getting back together and playing the classics because, I mean, there are some great reunion records, but there's also some stinkers out there. So, and sometimes you don't really know until it comes out. But, my whole thing is I think sometimes people put half-hearted reunion records out. Like, they'll just put whatever they release out. It's like, we're going to get in a studio and record something, and whatever that is our new music. And it's like, that's not always a good idea. So, as long as, and they are taking their time on it. So it's like, look, I mean, if they take their time on some new Jawbreaker, even though it's been 25 years, I mean, Blake has written, I mean, look at Jets to Brazil. He wrote some amazing songs post Jawbreaker. They're all still capable of writing some great music. But yeah, it's just interesting when you think, in that perspective, you're like, well, Dear You was 25 years ago. It's like, what would the follow-up be like? That's quite a bit. There's even, there's a lot of bands who've been putting stuff out, even like this year. I feel like I've interviewed a lot of people who are like, this is our first album in like a decade. And it's like, even decade's a long time, but 25 years is a very long time in between records, so I don't know. I'd be cautiously optimistic about a new Jawbreaker. I mean, they have worked on things, so it's not like maybe one day they will. I mean, they have talked about working on new music and that they have worked on new music. So, maybe someday they'll see the light of day. I don't know. Hopefully it has some of the magic of Dear You, but that one's so unfortunate to me because you look at it now 25 years later and people love that record. It's a fan favorite. Basically, I would say if 24-Hour Revenge Therapy isn't your favorite Jawbreaker record, Dear You probably is, and I'm in that camp. But, once again, 25 years ago, that one was released, totally different, totally different. Was not, really never received radio airplay. They made a music video for Fireman. I don't really think that got much play, and once again, the people who were fans beforehand, anyone who was really coming out was just pissed at them after. They didn't really get the record. I mean, I've heard tons of people who have said that, who heard the record when it came out, didn't like it, and, didn't turn around and, on it until like a decade later, so that's definitely a, it's normal when it comes to Jawbreaker, but it's unfortunate, I mean, it's a career. It helped end a career, but I think it also helped revive them, for the same things that broke them up. I think years later, those same songs were what made people like myself and a lot of others, look back on their catalog and go like, holy shit, like this band was really good. Like people didn't like this. Like I still can't believe that. Like listening to Dear You, like I knew the animosity and what it did to the band prior to hearing it. Like I knew that record like really hurt their career. And then I listened to it, I'm like how? Like I just don't get it. I'm like, this is their best stuff. Like how did this hurt them? Like it makes zero sense, But it's just one of those things you look back and, and another funny one, looking back, Cheshire Cat, Blink-182, when they were still Blink, that came out in 1995. And earlier this year, talking to Steve Kravac, who engineered that one. But it's like, that's another one where it's funny. Like when you look when that came out, it's kind of the opposite of that, where it's like, well, really not the opposite, because Dear You never really got big, but it's kind of the opposite of like, And Out Come the Wolves or something, where that was just huge right away and just fucking massive. And, Cheshire Cat's never, has never been Blink-182's biggest record. But if you go back and you listen to that, part of the charm is that I don't think you would ever think that was a band who was going to be huge. Like, if you go, and I really like that record. I really like Cheshire Cat. But like, literally, there's literally, in Just About Done, Mark is sitting there reciting lines from the movie Airplane. And, they have a song called Benoit Balls. Like, there's just, you look at it and you go, like, this isn't really the recipe for, like, a mainstream band. Like, you would never think that, and really just 4 years later, that's another amazing thing. If you look at Enema of the State in 1999, that's only 4 years removed from Cheshire Cat. Like that band who was massive and sold millions of records and, was like in Teen Beat or Tiger Beat and like TRL and all that, like just 4 years prior was like, I mean, really raw. Like you want to talk about like raw sounding, and that was far from being on a major label either, but I mean, also talk about like not knowing, what the trends in music could be. It's like, that would not be the band that I think you would assume would end up closing, the decade, being one of the biggest punk bands, of the decade easily, and culturally leaving such a big mark, because I mean, Dude Ranch ended up selling a lot, and Cheshire Cat had some minor hits. You had Carousel and M&M's. I mean, neither was very big. I think they got some play maybe on like K-Rock in Southern California. Like, so I mean, regionally they got a little attention with those, but didn't really get the attention for like another 4 years. But even in that, you think about, that's really not that long. Like the difference is so night and day. Like you would almost think that those are two different bands. You could almost play those for somebody and go, no, those are two different bands, and they would probably believe it. Like it's just so different in that way. It's amazing. It's amazing what a like short amount of time can do in that. But like the charm of that record, like you look back 25 years on that, and it's one of those albums where you go, it's not their breakthrough record. It's not even really the fan favorite. A lot of people don't like that record. But the reason I like it, and I look back on it so fondly, is I go 25 years ago, you can look and it's like, it's not the band that is big. It's not the household name band. It's not that band selling millions of records or playing arenas like at all. Like it's the band who's playing Soma in San Diego and are trying to record a record, or trying to record like 20 songs in 2 days, like that kind of band. And I love that. It's kind of a document on that, and also a document on that time too. I mean, ska being a huge one in 95, one of the biggest being Tragic Kingdom. And that one's still, it's so funny you look back on that now. And I mean, ska's kind of making a little bit of a comeback now, not mainstream wise, I would say. But you look back on something like that, and you look at like Tragic Kingdom, and it's like, and even No Doubt, such a mainstream band, you forget it's like, it's just a ska band. Like they were just a ska band. Like they started they were playing with like Real Big Fish and shit, like, you know, like just a ska punk band. And you look at a record like that, you know, went on and sold, I mean, I don't even know how many copies, but I can basically say, I would say of every record that I've talked about on this episode, I mean, that has to be like the biggest selling one. And, you know, once again, like, you still to this day hear it all on Top 40 radio, even to the, you know, like No Doubt. But I mean, still, if you listen to a song like Spiderwebs, like, wow, like, you know, it's amazing. It's that moment in time where you're like, that never would have been played on, you know, mainstream radio 10 years prior. And then 10 years later, it wouldn't be played, you know, on mainstream radio. It's really this sliver in time that, you know, I really think solidifies why the 90s were such a special, you know, kind of era for music. I mean, for myself and for a lot of others, because you look at it and you're like, what was considered popular? Like, if you look present day at what is mainstream considered popular, like, I feel like a lot of it fits together more and fits a certain mold. Whereas if you look at what was popular, like say in 1995, it's just all over the goddamn place. You know, I mean, it really is. I mean, you have, same with like, I mean, going off ska, even going further than that, you know, like big band swing and like shit like that, where you're like, who would think that was going to be big in that era? Like, you know what I mean? Like 50, 60 years after the fact, and then it becomes big again. And, you know, I mean, but that could coexist with ska and with, you know, punk and, you know, everything else going on too outside of that. You know, I'm also, you know, being kind of narrow here and just talking about a couple specific genres. But I mean, even outside of that, you look at just everything that kind of coexisted with one another on there, you know, and what was popular and, you know, what was played together, you know, or even just look at a good example of that. I always think of, if you ever want to look at like what was big in a certain year, go look at the lineup for radio festivals, because they're always like, every radio festival I've ever been to has some nutty ass lineup, but it's always great because once again, it's a document in time of like, whatever was really big at that time, but the bands never fit. It's never a lineup that you would see, you know, like as a tour or anything like that. It's these weird, you know, it's a weird thing that you see like one time. But, you know, if you go look back at like a radio festival and say 1995, it's like, you're going to see this crazy, you know, I'm sure Rancid played some of those, and it's like you probably see like fucking like Rancid play with like TLC or something like that. You know, like even if not like that specific example, like, you know, you would find something like that. And, you know, I really do, like, radio festivals are always like, I still think of some like up in Buffalo, I saw the Christmas Bash that like a top 40 station did in Buffalo, like back in like 03 and 04 were like 2 years that I went. And like, if you go look at those lineups, they're so weird. Like, they're the oddest thing, but they're what was big at the time. Like, you had artists playing with each other who would never, you know, you would never see them in another lineup again. You'll never see it again. You never saw it before. You'll never see it again. But like that like 1 year, just when they kind of put together whatever's popular at that time, it's just always funny. But some of the most eclectic ones though, have to be like in like 1995, because, you know, at that point, I mean, you have what's mainstream, you know, your top 40 music, your dance music, just, you know, I mean, really just pop music, you know, like this is, a lot of these records are popular, you know, Green Day has a record that's popular, but I wouldn't say they're pop music per se. But, you know, the stuff that was made just straight up pop to be a hit coexisted, you know, coincided with, you know, the punk bands and the alternative bands and the ska bands that were getting big, who, you know, weren't made to be hit machines, but just coincidentally or for whatever reason just stuck and were successful. And, you know, them just coexisting with each other, and was really an interesting thing and very cool, which I think you look back on now, like, because once again, I think, you know, major labels, and it's not like I'm super pro major label, but I'm just kind of, I think the more that I talk to people who have been on them, and the more you look back, you know, throughout time, I just become neutral on them, where I go, just because you're a major label doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It goes case by case. Same with indie labels. I mean, there are some terrible fucking indie labels out there who have screwed over bands way more than major labels have, you know, and vice versa. It just depends who you talk to. There's bands out there who have been screwed over by labels they're ran out of like a dude's like basement, you know? And then there's people who've been screwed over from labels that are ran in downtown Los Angeles, you know, that have, you know, from a 30-story building. Like it just, you know, it all just goes case by case. But, you know, I think you do look back though, and even though, you know, the major label machine did hurt bands, you know, once again, like, you know, like Jawbreaker, or another great one, Hum, who did release You'd Prefer an Astronaut in 1995, which, you know, that was on a major label. And, you know, Stars was a minor hit, but, you know, not a huge band. And, you know, like once again, didn't really, the label didn't really do for them what it did for, you know, other artists and stuff, you know, that just also happens. But the fact that major labels would take a chance on those bands and release that stuff is what I always think. You look back now and it's like, you know, even the ones that didn't stick, I still think it's cool that they put so much money behind. You know what I mean? Like the fact that there was a time that a band like Jawbreaker, like they got like $1 million to sign with Geffen. Like think about that though. Think about present day. Like just think about that for a second. They gave Jawbreaker $1 million to be on their label. Like that's insane. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's truly insane if you start to think about it. And that's pretty damn cool, to be honest. Like same with a band like Hum, or, you know, they didn't sign to it, but there's Texas is the reason. I mean, there's huge stories about that. They were offered like a $2 million major label deal. I forget which label it was, but back in the 90s, they were being offered like $2 million and courted by all these major labels. Like, and that's another band. Like we're talking about like Jawbreaker. Go listen to Texas is the Reason and be like, that band, you know what I mean? And not that they don't deserve it. They 100% do. I love those bands. But what I'm saying, like, you know what I'm saying. It's like you listen to that and you don't go, that's a major label artist. You know what I mean? Like you don't think of that now. But back then it was pretty damn cool that they did that. Now don't get me wrong. They were also doing it because they were trying to make money. Like it is a business once again. So them signing you because you kind of sound like Nirvana, you know, I mean, they were also doing it in hopes that you were going to make them a bunch of money. Like don't get me wrong. They give Texas as a Reason $2 million because they hope they can make $10 million off of them. But still, the fact that they would put money behind that and stuff, still, you have to believe in it to some degree. And, you know, as once again, I think that moment in time just very, very cool, you know, 25 years ago, because a lot of things that were released then just, you know, would definitely not be now. Like Tragic Kingdom is not something you would hear on a major label. And the best example of that is, I mean, the Interrupters, who are the biggest name in ska right now and a great, great band. But I mean, you know, even as big as they are, they're on Epitaph Records. Or, you know, actually, I don't even think they're on Epitaph. They're on Hellcat, Tim Armstrong's label, which is it's a part of Epitaph. So I mean, you know, basically Epitaph. But, you know, they're like the biggest band in ska, but they're not on a major label. And honestly, I don't know that they ever will be. You know, like, and that's the thing. Like that really goes to show you. Same like pop punk bands. It's like the biggest pop punk band now is whatever band it would be, you know, I mean, take out like Green Days and Blink-182s. Like if we're talking more bands who have been, you know, who have say united, or not united, but you know, have formed in the last say 15 years. Like let's say from 2005 on, if your band, any band that has existed in pop punk who's you know, who started after 2005, the biggest bands of that of those are not on major labels. They never will be. They were never offered. There was never a time they were gonna. Because you also hear a lot of bands who never even got on major labels who are courted a lot. You know, NoFX is another one. You know, going back to them, it's like they were courted for major labels for a very long time, and you know, never did it. But it's like still major labels are courting that, whereas now the major labels aren't going to court. You know what I mean? Like in 2020, like. There's not a major label who's trying to sign No Doubt or NoFX, you know, to a deal because they think they're going to make them tons and tons of money. You know, it just wouldn't happen. You know, there's those records. You know, I mean, same with Smashing Pumpkins. You look at Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. That turned 25 this year. Great record. And you know, it's this double disc, and I mean, you know, there's hits on it. But still, like, those were hits. You know what I mean? Like, that's amazing that was, like, a mainstream thing that, you know, that, like, people could agree on and actually liked. You know what I mean? It's not this. What I'm getting at is it's not that like I know it's a great record, but it's like to me I look at it and go, you would almost think it's a record just like, you know, kind of how like Let It Be or Tim or, you know, any of your favorite Replacements records are, where there's music aficionados or people who are really fans of a certain kind of music who know it's a great record, but the mainstream doesn't. You know what I mean? Like I know the Replacements are great. I know Paul Westerberg, you know, is like one of the greatest songs. He is the greatest songwriter in my opinion, but to not have such a strong opinion, I'll tone it back and say one of the greatest. But you know, even with that said, he's not mainstream enough. You know, I mean, he's had brushes with success, and you know, he's had things that are maybe more mainstream than others. But it's like, you know, a guy like that, you know, there's a lot of stuff that he's written where I listen to like anything off like Sorry Ma, Forgot to Take Out the Trash. I go like, this is genius, but I realize it's never going to be, you know, that wasn't going to be the era of the Replacements that was going to get signed to a major label. You know, that's not the band that Sire wanted. You know, they wanted them maybe closer to like what they sounded like during Let It Be. But, you know, there were a lot of raw punk bands who, you know, in 1995, major labels were like, no, like, we want that. Like, we will sign that. And, you know, once again, some of it stuck, some of it didn't. But the fact that it was even given that chance, giving that platform, you know, or that those bands would also play late night, you know, that you'd see a lot of them. But, yeah, you know, I mean, 1995, just a big year for a lot of bands starting. You know, a lot of bands had their, like, sophomore and debuts. You also had, I mean, the end of it, the Ramones had Adios Amigos. Their very last record came out 25 years ago, and a pretty good record, I got to say. I mean, CJ, if you don't listen to a lot of later era Ramones, I think CJ really put like a breath of fresh air in that band on some of the last few records that he was on. And on Adios Amigos, I mean, he sings like 3 or 4 songs on it. And so, I mean, a good chunk of the record is sung by CJ, but really, really good. Like, that record is a really solid one. You know, I mean, look it's never going to be something. They're one of the first punk bands of all time. It's like those first couple records just basically helped create a genre and like influenced everybody in it. Like, if you're in a punk band and you're not influenced by the Ramones, like, get the fuck out of here. Like, I don't know who you are. Like, I don't think it's possible. Like, you don't have to, like, I get it. Like, you may be like, maybe you're a punk band, but like, maybe you're not influenced by the Misfits. And it's like, I mean, okay, like, I mean, tons are, but all right, fine. Like, you're not a fan of the Misfits, all right, I guess I can understand it. You know, there's different artists is what I'm getting at. It's like, okay, like, maybe you're in a punk band, but you're not influenced by Crass, or you don't like Bad Religion or this or that. There's some bands where it's like, oh, okay, whatever. The Ramones are one, though, where I go, I don't care what kind of punk you're playing. You could be playing the crustiest of punk. You could be playing the polished pop punk. And if the Ramones are not one of your influences, I just don't quite understand you. And I can't imagine I'm going to like what you're releasing. But anyway, when you put something out that important early on in your career, like with the Ramones, you know, your later stuff's going to get overshadowed. But Adios Amigos, still one of their best later era records. And, you know, once again, CJ Ramone had some damn fine songs on there that, you know, a lot of them that Dee Dee Ramone actually wrote. And he did better than Dee Dee did. The Crusher being one of them. One of the best songs on the record, in my opinion. And CJ does that one better than Dee Dee does. You can hear both versions, and I think anyone will tell you, even Dee Dee purists who maybe weren't as big of a fan of CJ, I think they'd have to tell you that CJ just absolutely makes that song. I mean, really breathes some light into it that you know, you really you don't hear in the Dee Dee version, you know, which I can't say enough good things about CJ in that way. You know, also taking on a band that you go in the Ramones, who were already legendary. You're joining a legendary band. It's not like CJ joined and then they got big. Like, he was joining a band who was already, you know, the legend status, you know, had already at that point been around like 13 years or something. You know, they were the veteran band at that point. And, you know, to come in and take over shoes as big as Dee Dee's too, and to do a job like that, you know, is absolutely amazing, and definitely deserves some credit. He is a great guy, and still my favorite interview I've ever done was having him on the show early on. And yeah, I love that one. Another great one, I mean, Alien Lanes, Guided by Voices. That's another one that's just pure 90s and not on a major label, though they ended up being on a major label like a record or two later. And but still, like, you just listen to that and you're like, that's like an indie favorite, though, you know, and it's still kind of a cult classic. Not that you really hear Guided by Voices like you're probably not going to hear Game of Pricks on the radio, but it's like still like songs like that and A Salty Salute. Like there's songs on that record that are really just like, if we're talking indie rock, I mean, they're just the gold standard, you know. I mean, same with Here's Where the Strings Come In, my all-time favorite Superchunk record. Just such a good record. That one came out in 95. And again, just you listen to that and you go like, to me, that's just good indie rock. Like, I mean, solid. Like, and people love the Pixies and Pavement and, you know, just different bands like that they would probably reference, like if we're talking like, you know, 90s alt rock or whatever. But really, in my opinion, in 1995 being such a big year of that, I mean, the Guided by Voices with Alien Lanes, the Superchunks with Here's Where the Strings Come In, and Arches of Loaf with Vivi, their second record, you know, I mean, right after Icky Metal, you come off something as strong as Icky Metal. And Vivi's another great one with some classic Arches of Loaf songs on there. But it's like, that to me is more the gold standard of indie rock. Like, if we're really talking about that of the 90s, like, that's where it's at. It's not with the Pixies. It's not with Pavement. You know, it's with Superchunk. It's with Arches of Loaf. It's with Guided by Voices, you know. And those bands get credit, but not to the point that they should. You know, all those bands mentioned should be like headlining, you know, the Coachellas of the world and things like that. You know, those bands should get more of the attention than they do. You know, I think they're appreciated in like, you know, record store circles and like college rock or, you know, college radio kind of circles and things like that. You know, that's kind of where they maybe get their accolades and their nods. But, you know, mainstream radio and just mainstream in general, you know, like if you're going to be like, yeah, like, you know, that like rock radio, who, you know, plays a lot of that, and even like Smashing Pumpkins, which I love, or No Doubt, you know, some of those other, even though it's not indie rock, but like the alternative of the time, it's like they should throw on songs from Vivi or Alien Lanes, you know, on some of those stations, you know, and I get it. I mean, Alien Lanes a little more rough around the edges at parts, but, you know, at the same time, I mean, it influenced so many artists that, you know, that they would play on the radio, you know, or that you would hear on that rock station. And it's like, why not play the thing that inspired them? You know, I mean, the Strokes being one of that. I mean, look at how massive the Strokes were. And, you know, I mean, Is This It? Their debut came out in 2001, you know, so that's 6 years later after Alien Lanes, and all of them, I think, will tell you that was a huge record for them. I know one of them wrote a article, you know, a few years ago for like Spin Magazine about, you know, what the impact that Alien Lanes had on them. Like honestly, like, you know, you just look at that and it's like those are the bands that I think should get more attention, you know, kind of legacy bands than some of the other ones. And no disrespect, like the Pixies and Pavement. And, you know, I mean, I keep picking on those two. And I think it's because, just once again, that like Pavement, to me, like, I heard Arches of Loaf before I ever heard Pavement, but I've always heard people talk about how great Pavement is. And I listened to them and I just went, I think the people who really like Pavement have just never heard Arches of Loaf. I'm like, this just sounds like a not as good version of Arches of Loaf. Like, it's not terrible. Like, I mean, I don't hate it. Like, I wouldn't be pissed if I heard that on a radio station. I wouldn't change the station. But, you know, just in terms of accolades and, like, you know, all the attention it gets, I go like, man, why aren't people giving this to, like, Arches of Loaf? Like, how is Arches of Loaf this obscure band when you have something like this that, you know, is just as comparable? And, you know, but it's the same thing. You just never know it's going to be big. I've always said, like, with Dookie, you know, and Dookie deserves to be the massive record it does. But why was Dookie so big, and why wasn't, you know, half of the rest of the Lookout Records roster just to, you know, like Mr. Tear Experience and the Queers and Screeching Weasel, like all those bands who were contemporaries of Green Day, like they were putting out records just as good as Dookie, like, but they just weren't hitting the same way. They weren't getting as big. The Muffs too, you know, they put out Blonder and Blonder, in 1995. And I mean, I think it sold some records, but it's like the Muffs were never as big as they should have been. And like, that's one of those records where I listen to that and I go, it's another one where production-wise, it's not overdone, it's not overpolished, but it sounds good. It's a good-sounding record, but it's still, like Kim Shattuck's, I mean, her iconic, just that roar that she does, like it's still intact there. It sounds great. And that one was on a major label too. That was one where they took a chance on something where, really should have been bigger than it was. And I don't get how it wasn't. I don't get why the Muffs weren't as big as, like Green Day. I mean, I think they easily deserve to be, for sure. But so things like that. That's another one. Like the Muffs to think now. It's like, when the Muffs got back together in the 2000s, it's like, major labels weren't knocking on their door or knocking their door down, to like get them to do like the reunion album. But in that time, there was that era where, there was a place for them. There was a place for them on major labels. And, I think it's awesome. But, it was really a time and place. Same with All. All put Pummel out. And, as you probably saw on Filmage, if you've ever watched that, and if you haven't, one of the best music documentaries out there, well worth checking out. I haven't seen it actually in a few years. It's probably time. I watch it every couple years. It's probably time for another Filmage viewing. But, if you watch that, like with All, the frustrations of them throughout the 90s, really trying to be a commercially viable band and, being getting on the radio and whatnot and, kind of playing the major label game and it just never happening. But, once again, still cool that could be released on a major label. And, they ended up playing, I believe it was Conan O'Brien that they performed on back in 95. And once again, just cool little things like that where you're like, those aren't bands who were regulars on late night TV. And it's not like you hear All on like commercial radio. But the fact that they were on major labels for that second, it gave them those opportunities where there are these cool little things that they did where you're like, oh, that's really neat that band that means so much to you was on there, even though they may not be the band that you think of when you think of late night TV or those kinds of things, they did get to do it. They did get their turn with it, which is very cool to look at. And, that's really why I wanted to talk about that for this episode. 1995, 25 years ago, just a special, the 90s in general, but really 1995 kind of being that time where you had a couple bands that major labels took chances on, with Nirvana, with Green Day, that ended up paying off. That ended up selling a bunch of records. And by 1995, I'd really say that's where you really started to see it. Really more for like punk rock. Grunge had its thing in 91, but once 94 hit and really was able to flourish like it did because of grunge a few years earlier, after that was the domino effect for punk rock. In 1995 was just, such a great year for that. Once again, this is like half a list, but just like some of the records I've talked about on this episode and, just kind of jump down and really like Sparkle and Fade from Everclear. Here's Where the Strings Come In from Superchunk. Adios Amigos from the Ramones. Blink-182 put out Cheshire Cat. Guided by Voices put out Alien Lanes. Green Day put out Insomniac. Rancid put out And Out Come the Wolves. Jawbreaker put out Dear You. The Muffs put out Blonder and Blonder. No Doubt put out Tragic Kingdom. You had not Face to Face, No Use for a Name, putting out Leche Con Carne. Lagwagon put out Hoss. Pennywise put out About Time. Arches of Loaf put out VV. The Smashing Pumpkins with Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. You had Lifetime, who I didn't even get into, but Lifetime on Jade Tree with Hello Bastards. Such a solid, debut record right there. And, All with Pummel and Less Than Jake with Pezcore. Just some solid ska that year. Solid ska, solid punk, solid pop punk, pop rock. Even though I don't think it was being called college rock at that time, there's a lot of good, basically at that point, indie rock. But, I would say bands like Superchunk and Arches of Loaf kind of, carrying the torch of what the REMs and the replacements of the 80s were doing and, doing it in the 90s. But yeah, 1995, an amazing time for music, an amazing year for music, right in the middle there. And, kind of that in between there. Punk was big, but it wasn't the polished punk of like Enema of the State. You know, it was still that kind of rough around the edges, of like Dookie, really. And just a really good time for music, I would say. A really solid time. There's a reason why I'm attracted to that era and why, so many of my favorite bands come from that. And I just think it's that, and it really does. I mean, you have bands to thank for it. You have success to thank for it prior to that, because that's why so many labels are taking chances. But, things were good for those bands. I think bands could make a few dollars, and once again, it's not even the fact of they could be millionaires, but just the fact that even the ones who weren't massive could do it as their day job, and I think it really helped the quality of the music. It allowed them to pay attention to that, to really focus on it 100% and make the band their full-time commitment. And yeah, not all of them got rich, but even if they didn't have to work for 3 or 4 years while they toured the world and released a couple records, an amazing thing, which I'm very thankful for as a fan, And also, I mean, once again, shout out Matt Pinfield in 120 minutes. I mean, I know 120 minutes was around pre-Pinfield, but I mean, he's kind of the quintessential host, and that's the greatest era of that show. And, just what he brought to the show, what he brought to the table, and, really bringing those bands to light in a more mainstream audience and getting out there to people who otherwise wouldn't, hear those bands, just such a cool thing that, it kind of goes with the compilation, which I love talking about on here, where like things change. Sometimes they expand, the compilation may not be the big thing anymore, but now it's a new way to promote your music and stuff. It just always changes. It never stays the same. Whatever way you have now. I was talking about this a few weeks ago with Bill McShane when he was on the show. How artists now. I mean, there's artists who have gotten big from TikTok. Like TikTok, they've used to get popular. And the thing with that is that's great, but like what you also have to realize is that that's the kind of thing. It's gonna last for a while, but it's not gonna last forever. It's the same thing with compilations or even signing to a major label. There's a time where getting big meant signing to a major label. That's how you got big. It doesn't mean that anymore. Right now, maybe certain people are getting big off TikTok, and maybe that is a way to, get big, get your music out there. But in 10 years, it won't be. That stuff changes just so constantly. And, it was kind of nice, though, because I think that sliver in time in the 90s, there were more resources than the internet's a great equalizer, but there was a lot of money behind a lot of bands who otherwise probably didn't have it before or after, So, just very cool. I want to talk about that, but that is going to be the episode. Hopefully you enjoyed. And actually, I made this playlist last week kind of for a teaser for this podcast, but if you've not heard it yet, I made a 3-hour playlist of all songs from 1995, all from releases from that year. So go check that out on our Spotify page. I mean, every band that I talked about on here, all those records, there's stuff from all of them, plus a bunch of other bands that I even get to talk about because I was just looking at the time. We're already at an hour and 15 here, and don't want to keep you much longer. But I could go on about this forever. But yeah, go check out that playlist. All this stuff from 1995. Really listen to it and see why I'm saying what a special year that was. And check out all the other playlists on there. We put up a playlist of everything I play on the radio show every week, which we're now doing 2 hours a week, which I'm very stoked about. And shout out to WRFA for letting me do that. But you can go check out those playlists on Spotify. Give us a follow. We're at Power Chord Hour on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We're on YouTube. Shout out to you if you're listening to this on YouTube right now. And hit me up, powerchordhour@gmail.com. We got some stickers and guitar picks that I'm giving out absolutely free. Just hit me up. Let me know that you want some. I'll mail you some. And we do have Power Chord Hour t-shirts. Those ones are free, but if you want one of those, here is the catch. Go rate and review the show on iTunes. Send us a screenshot, and we'll send you one. Not much of a catch, but you got to do a little more for it than you do for the free stickers. But yeah, so I mean, if you like a free shirt, rate and review us. If you still want free shit, but you're too lazy to go write a review, just hit me up, powerchordhour@gmail.com. I'll still send you some stickers and guitar picks. I just want to thank you for listening to the show. If you've listened to the end of this, thank you very much for checking it all out. And I just very much appreciate it. We'll be back next week, I believe, with a guest. But, I like doing these solo every now and then. I like to have guests, but I also like to come on here and just kind of bullshit about music for a while. And that's exactly what we did. And I hope you enjoyed this one. So until next episode for the Power Chord Hour, I'm Anthony Merchant. Thanks for listening.